In June 1943, deep in the South Pacific, on a chain of islands smothered in jungle, choked with mud and rot, where maps were useless and radios often fell silent, an arduous campaign would unfold. There, in a place almost no one remembers today, in an unforgiving landscape, thousands of men would descend into a green inferno, and many would never come back. This is not the story of a famous landing or a celebrated victory. This is the story of a forgotten battlefield, New Georgia. But before we move on, a brief word from today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Supremacy, Call of War 1942, a free online PvP strategy game set in authentic World War II global warfare. In Supremacy, you take command of a real country in World War II and face off against up to 99 other players, all battling it out in real time over days and weeks. It's long-term grand strategy, diplomacy, economics, warfare, all happening with real opponents. Build your army from the ground up, from tanks, artillery, fighter aircraft, naval forces, and even secret weapons like early nuclear technology. And right now, the game has introduced a brand new Marines update, adding elite amphibious troops designed for rapid coastal assaults, island landings, and stealthy shoreline operations, opening up entirely new tactical options, especially in the early and mid-game. Forge alliances, plan invasions, break truces, or survive everyone else doing the same. Every match becomes its own alternate history story. If you enjoy deep strategy, historical settings, and outmaneuvering real players in real time, this game is absolutely worth trying. And the best part? You can play anywhere, PC or mobile, same account, same match. Use the link in the video description to get an exclusive starter pack, including the new loot boxes that can drop the brand new Marines unit of a $25 value, free for the next 30 days. Click the link, claim your reward, and start your campaign for global conquest today. Following the hard-won Allied successes in Papua New Guinea at the grueling battles along the Kokoda Track at Milne Bay and in the costly final struggle at Buna and Gona, and especially after the equally brutal 7-month-long battle of epic proportions around Guadalcanal, fought on land, in the air, and across the seas, where both sides were stretched to the breaking point, the Japanese expansion across the Pacific was finally halted. With the initiative now firmly in their hands, it was time for the Allies to press forward and continue their advance through the South Pacific, opening the way toward the heart of the Japanese Empire. Situated in the western reaches of the Central Solomons, the island of New Georgia and its surrounding group had been recognized as a future Allied objective as early as mid-1942, intended to be taken only after the securing of Tulagi and Guadalcanal in the southern Solomons. This objective formed only one step in a much broader sequence of operations first outlined by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and later refined into the series of Elkton plans. By mid-1943, these evolving concepts were consolidated under a single name, Operation Cartwheel, a massive Allied campaign designed to drive steadily northwest through the Solomons and New Guinea toward the same final objective, the seizure of the great Japanese bastion at Rabaul on the island of New Britain in the Bismarck archipelago. However, just as the Allies were determined to advance on Rabaul, the Japanese were equally determined to hold it. From the moment they seized the town from Australian forces in February 1942, they set about transforming Rabaul into a major stronghold, part fortress, part logistical hub, and simultaneously the cornerstone of Japan's South Pacific defenses and the main base from which its forces projected offensive operations. Its vast natural harbour and multiple airfield sites made it the most strategically valuable position in the region, and together with the major fleet base at Truk in the Caroline Islands, Rabaul formed a barrier that blocked every viable Allied route toward the Philippines, and ultimately toward Japan. The importance of Rabaul had been recognized by Japanese planners long before the Pacific War began. As early as November 1941, Imperial General Headquarters issued directives calling for its capture at the first opportunity after the fall of Guam. Once in Japanese hands, Rabaul quickly grew into the premier bastion of the Southeast Pacific area. By 1943, it housed a large garrison, extensive fortifications, and a network of airfields that shielded the warships and transports anchored in its superb harbor. On these airfields, the Japanese assembled one of the most powerful concentrations of air power found anywhere outside the home islands. During 1942 and well into 1943, Rabaul supported several hundred aircraft from both the Imperial Navy and the Army Air Services, including fighter groups, medium and heavy bombers, dive bombers, torpedo aircraft, reconnaissance units, and long-range patrol squadrons. But as Allied air power in the theatre grew stronger and Japanese losses mounted, maintaining this large air arm required a continuous flow of replacement aircraft and trained crews. To meet these demands, Japan repeatedly drew upon its land-based Navy units and, most importantly, the carrier air groups concentrated at the fleet base at Truk, which served as the primary staging hub for aircraft, supplies, and personnel moving south. Yet every squadron diverted to Rabaul further weakened the carrier force. This slow, steady drain of experienced pilots and aircraft left the combined fleet increasingly unable to contest major American amphibious operations in the months ahead. And it was one of the key reasons Japan could not significantly oppose US offensives in the Central Pacific until mid-1944, when its remaining carriers suffered catastrophic losses in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Still, despite mounting attrition, Japan continued to feed fresh air units into Rabaul, determined to maintain air superiority over New Guinea and the Solomons. These forces formed the protective shield that made every Allied advance perilous. The workhorse of Japanese air power at this time was the formidable Mitsubishi A6M, known to the Allies as the Zeke, but remembered simply as the Zero. With exceptional range and superb maneuverability, the Zero was a lethal dogfighter, and in the hands of Japan's highly trained pilots, it outclassed early American fighters such as the P-39 and P-40. As the war dragged on, however, the Zero's limitations in speed, firepower, and ruggedness became evident. Against newer US aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat, the P-51 Mustang, and the P-38 Lightning, it struggled badly. Even so, when flown by seasoned veterans, it remained a dangerous opponent until the final year of the war. Paired with the long-range G-4M Betty bomber, the Zero gave Japan the ability to project air power across vast distances. From Rabaul, these aircraft struck Allied airfields on Guadalcanal and along the New Guinea coast, hunted shipping in the Coral Sea, and provided air cover for convoys moving through the Solomons and the Bismarck archipelago. Together, they formed the striking arm that made Rabaul not just a fortress, but the beating heart of Japan's defensive system in the South Pacific. On November 18, 1942, Rabaul became the headquarters of the newly formed 8th Area Army under Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, established to improve coordination between Japan's two major campaigns in the South Pacific. About a month later, it also became the main base of Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka's Southeast Area Fleet. From this strategic citadel, Imamura and Kusaka attempted to direct Japan's wide-ranging operations in New Guinea and the Solomons. Yet, as in so many other battles across the Pacific, their efforts were hampered by the chronic inability of the Imperial Army and Navy to form a genuinely unified command. Although both services operated as co-equals under Imperial General Headquarters, and while the Army and Navy sections in Tokyo could align broad strategic objectives, this cooperation rarely translated into true unity at the operational level. Each branch maintained its own command system, its own priorities, and its own supply networks. In practice, coordination often depended less on formal planning than on the personalities and relationships of the officers involved. In early April 1943, however, a temporary attempt at greater unity emerged. Recognizing that the main Allied threat was now coming from the south, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's principal strategist and architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, moved his headquarters from Truk to Rabaul to personally oversee operations in the South Pacific. Backed by immense authority and personal prestige, Yamamoto briefly imposed a measure of cohesion on Japan's otherwise fragmented war effort. Almost immediately upon his arrival, he set in motion Operation I-Go, a plan he had personally conceived and ordered. The operation consisted of a series of major airstrikes against American bases on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, as well as Oro and Milne Bays in New Guinea, intended to slow the Allied advance and buy precious time for Japan to strengthen its defenses. With the operation completed, Yamamoto prepared to tour forward positions, both to award medals to aircrews who had distinguished themselves during I-Go and to inspect progress on the defenses being built on Bougainville. Yet, unknown to him, American codebreakers had intercepted messages outlining his precise schedule, including departure and arrival times, planned route, and even the composition of his escort. Once the intelligence was confirmed, the Americans reacted quickly, as the opportunity was simply too great to be missed. Swiftly, they devised a plan to intercept Yamamoto and his escorts in an operation that would soon be given the codename Vengeance. There was, however, one serious obstacle. Navy Wildcat and Corsair fighters stationed on Guadalcanal lacked sufficient range to carry out this mission. But the Americans possessed the perfect machine for the task, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters that had recently been deployed to the theater and whose long range and high speed made the mission possible. At dawn on April 18th, a specially selected group of P-38s lifted off from Guadalcanal, each carrying extra fuel for the more than 700-kilometer flight over open water, the longest fighter interception mission of the entire war. Their timing was precise. Yamamoto's aircraft departed Rabaul exactly on schedule, only to fly straight into the American trap. In the short, violent engagement that followed, the P-38s shot down both Japanese bombers, killing Yamamoto in one of them, and 3 of the escorting Zero fighters at the cost of a single American aircraft. Operation Vengeance succeeded completely, removing Japan's most respected strategist and delivering a symbolic blow at a critical point in the campaign. This irreplaceable loss, coming on top of Japan's inherently divided command structure, further eroded the empire's ability to mount a coherent defense. By then, after the hard campaigns in Papua New Guinea and Guadalcanal, General Imamura's 8th Area Army oversaw 2 field armies. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi's 18th Army bore primary responsibility for operations in eastern New Guinea, while Lieutenant General Haruyoshi Hyakutaki's 17th Army was tasked with operations in the Solomons. As 8th Area Army Headquarters shifted its main effort toward renewing offensive operations in New Guinea, the Solomons were to be held by an active defense intended to safeguard Rabaul. Drawing on his costly experience at Guadalcanal, General Hyakutake understood that effective operations, whether offensive or defensive, required secure and reliable supply lines. Accordingly, he chose to concentrate his defensive efforts on Bougainville and the surrounding islands in northern Solomons, believing that the islands farther south would be too difficult to supply. There, he deployed the strongest formation under his command, the 6th Infantry Division, while the remnants of his 2nd Division, the 38th, shattered during the fighting on Guadalcanal, were still in the process of refitting. However, as the Japanese braced for the next Allied move, the Imperial Army and Navy continued to fight what were, in effect, 2 separate wars in the same theater, and their strategic priorities rarely aligned. In addition to the Northern Solomons, the Navy insisted on holding the islands of Santa Isabel and New Georgia in the Central Solomons as forward outposts for the defense of Bougainville and ultimately Rabaul itself. In addition to being merely forward outposts, the New Georgia Group carried an additional strategic weight. In November 1942, while the battle for Guadalcanal still raged, Japanese engineers quietly moved onto the island where, concealed beneath masterful camouflage and largely unnoticed by American reconnaissance, they began building an airfield on Munda Point at the old Australian Methodist mission. By December 15th, the strip was operational, and work soon began on another field at Vila on nearby Kolombangara Island. Once the Americans detected these bases, New Georgia's importance became obvious. Whoever controlled the island group would dictate the air war in the Central Solomons. The Japanese fully understood this and had no intention of abandoning the position without a determined fight. To reinforce the area, the Navy moved first. In early March, it dispatched the few ground forces available to it, sending the 7th Combined Special Naval Landing Force to Santa Isabel and the 8th to New Georgia. It then pressed General Imamura to commit more army troops, arguing that the small detachment already on the island was far from adequate. Imamura, still emphasizing the immense difficulty of supplying these isolated positions, hesitated at first. Eventually he agreed, authorizing the deployment of additional forces organized under a new formation, the Southeastern Detachment, an ad hoc created headquarters under the 17th Army, commanded by Major General Noboru Sasaki, established specifically to oversee army forces in the Central Solomons. This build-up was followed on March 22nd by a formal agreement between the two services defining responsibility for the defense of the Solomons. The Army would take charge of the Northern Solomons, while the Navy assumed responsibility for the Central Solomons under Vice Admiral Tomoshige Samajima's 8th Fleet. Recognizing that this paper division alone was insufficient, Imperial Headquarters took a further step in early May. On May 2nd, it ordered that a joint command arrangement be established in the New Georgia area. Although administratively attached to the 17th Army, General Sasaki was placed under the operational control of the 8th Fleet and given responsibility for all land defenses in the sector, while Admiral Ota retained command of naval ground forces. It was an awkward, criss-crossing structure, and while it represented a genuine attempt at unity, coordination in practice remained uneven and often fell short of what the situation demanded. By the beginning of July, Japanese defensive arrangements on New Georgia had taken their final shape. General Sasaki's Southeastern Detachment, built around 2 battalions of the 229th Infantry Regiment of the 38th Division and the entire 13th Infantry Regiment of the fresh 6th Division, was responsible for defending the Munda airfield. In addition to its infantry corps, the detachment included a range of engineering and service units, reinforced by anti-aircraft and artillery elements, among them 3 coastal artillery batteries emplaced around Munda, armed with 140mm, 120mm, and 80mm guns. Meanwhile, the Navy's ground units, operating under their own command structure, were tasked with holding the areas around Enogai Inlet and Bairoko Harbor. Altogether, roughly 6,000 Army and Navy personnel were positioned on New Georgia, most concentrated around Munda, with another 5,000, primarily on Kolombangara across Kula Gulf, prepared to support the defense for as long as the 8th Fleet could maintain a steady flow of reinforcements and supplies. While the Japanese were digging in across the Central Solomons, the Allies were preparing for the next phase of the campaign. But their efforts were shaped, and often limited, by decisions made far from the battlefield. Back in December 1941, at the First Washington Conference, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill agreed on a principle that would define the entire Allied war effort. Their decision, generally known as Germany First, recognized Germany as the more dangerous opponent, while operations against Japan would remain strategically defensive until the war in Europe was under control. By assigning the Pacific only secondary priority, the policy carried enormous consequences. It meant that the fight against Japan would have to be waged with limited forces, limited supplies, and limited attention. At a time when virtually everything, from aircraft and infantry to transport shipping, was already being earmarked for the major operations that Allied planners anticipated in the Mediterranean and Europe. These constraints would shape every Allied move in the early stages of the Pacific campaign. Yet despite the broader Germany First strategy, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff never lost sight of the danger Japan posed in the Pacific. Before they could even think about long-term operations, however, they needed to bring order to a theatre that stretched across thousands of miles. That effort began on March 30, 1942, when, after consultation with Australia, New Zealand, and other Allied partners, the Pacific was divided into two great commands, the Southwest Pacific Area and the Pacific Ocean areas. Together they formed a defensive arc running from Hawaii through Australia and New Zealand, anchoring the vital lines of communication that held the Allied position together. The Southwest Pacific Area, which included Australia, New Guinea, New Britain, and most of the Solomons, was placed under Army authority and entrusted to General Douglas MacArthur, who had arrived in Australia on March 17th after being ordered to leave the Philippines before the islands fell to the Japanese. The rest of the Pacific became the domain of the US Navy under Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, already commander of the Pacific Fleet and now appointed commander-in-chief of the Pacific Ocean areas. To manage this vast expanse, Nimitz subdivided his command into the North, Central, and South Pacific areas, assigning Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley to lead the South Pacific Force. As a practical compromise, a boundary line roughly following the 159th meridian east was established, separating MacArthur's Southwest Pacific from the Navy's South Pacific Command. In theory, MacArthur and Nimitz operated as parallel, co-equal commanders, reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in an arrangement intended to impose order on the sprawling Pacific theatre, but in practice it produced a milder version of the same inter-service tension that troubled the Japanese. The Navy viewed the Pacific as its natural domain, believing that any major operation across thousands of miles of ocean would inevitably depend on naval forces. The Army, for its part, was equally unwilling to place its operations under naval control. In the end, neither service was willing to surrender control to a rival command that it believed would not fully understand or support its doctrines, methods, or priorities, while both guarded their resources closely and each pushed to influence the direction of the campaign according to its own institutional outlook. Still, even with limited manpower and material, Washington and Canberra were not content to sit behind a defensive shield. On July 2nd, the Joint Chiefs issued the order that would open a new chapter in the Pacific War, directing area commanders to begin offensive operations in the Solomons. The plan was to unfold in 3 stages. The first phase, aimed at seizing Tulagi and Guadalcanal in the southern Solomons, was assigned to the Navy under the South Pacific area. The remaining 2 phases, which involved advancing through the rest of the Solomons, moving into northeastern New Guinea, and ultimately capturing Rabaul, were placed under Army control in MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area. Upon receiving Joint Chiefs of Staff orders, the commanders of the South and Southwest Pacific areas met in Melbourne, Australia, to discuss the 3 tasks. They agreed that the advance should be governed by 2 basic concepts: the progressive forward movement to seize air and naval bases in New Guinea, New Britain, and the Northern Solomons. With these bases secured, Allied fighter planes and bombers would be in position to cover the entire Bismarck archipelago, eastern New Guinea and Solomons area, and isolate Rabaul from the east, west, and south before troops were put ashore to capture the Great Base. Under the direction of the South Pacific Force, the opening move came on August 7, 1942, when the 1st Marine Division landed on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. And while Tulagi was captured quickly, Guadalcanal, however, became the site of a far longer, far bloodier struggle, one that neither side had anticipated. As the struggle on Guadalcanal approached its climax, a major change in command reshaped the South Pacific. On October 18th, Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. replaced Admiral Gormley as commander of the South Pacific area. Immediately, Halsey threw his full energy and aggressive spirit into the job, guiding the hardest American campaign thus far in the Pacific to its conclusion. But with the first phase of operations in the Solomons completed, he now stood at the edge of MacArthur's theater, where his next moves would push much of the U.S. Navy deep into an area formerly controlled by the Army. Yet, despite MacArthur's forceful personality, which frequently created friction with his subordinates, his relationship with Halsey turned out to be a notable exception. The two commanders quickly built a genuine mutual respect, and that personal rapport went a long way toward keeping the Solomons campaign functioning with a level of cooperation between Army and Navy that was better than one might expect given chronic inter-service tension that persisted throughout the war. Their good relationship and coordination also helped them to overcome an awkward two-track command arrangement, with Halsey directing operations in the Solomons under MacArthur's broad strategic guidance, even as his naval forces remained under Nimitz's authority. It was the kind of setup that could easily have collapsed under inter-service rivalry, yet Halsey handled it with remarkable finesse, satisfying both superiors, retaining real operational independence, and driving the campaign forward with unmistakably his own style. With Guadalcanal secured and the first phase of the Solomon Islands offensive complete, both Halsey and MacArthur began looking toward the next great objective, Rabaul. In this early planning, MacArthur held a clear advantage. His headquarters had already been thinking several steps ahead, and he soon put forward an ambitious concept for taking the Japanese stronghold through a converging advance along two mutually supporting axes. In doing so, MacArthur effectively sought to combine the second and third phases of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's directive from July 2, 1942, into a single continuous operation. According to his plan, the first thrust would advance up the northeastern coast of New Guinea, seizing airfields on the Huon Peninsula before pushing on to New Britain and capturing Kavieng in New Ireland. The second would drive through the Solomons, beginning with the seizure of the Munda Point airfield on New Georgia and continuing northward to Bougainville. Together, these advances were meant to converge on Rabaul, but the scale of the plan, codenamed Elkton, was vast. Its execution would have required 5 additional divisions, 45 more air groups, and enormous numbers of warships and transport vessels. In early 1943, such a concentration of forces in the Pacific was simply beyond reach. That reality was confirmed at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. There, Roosevelt and Churchill once again reaffirmed the Germany First strategy. Although the US and British combined Chiefs of Staff were determined to maintain the initiative in the Southwest and South Pacific, seeking to inflict heavy losses on Japan and prevent it from digging in, and eventually to capture Rabaul for use as a forward base, the broader decision was unmistakable. The Pacific would remain a secondary theater, and any advance toward Rabaul would have to be achieved with limited resources. In the wake of the Casablanca Conference, the implications of the Germany First strategy were made unmistakably clear. On March 10, 1943, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff met in Washington with representatives from the Pacific Area Commands at what became known as the Pacific Military Conference. During these discussions, Washington planners informed the Pacific commanders that only 2 or 3 additional divisions and a limited number of aircraft could be made available. Virtually everything else, including the bulk of new aircraft, infantry and shipping, was already committed to the Mediterranean and the coming campaigns in Europe. As a result, the sweeping directive issued on July 2, 1942, was quietly set aside in favor of a far more realistic approach. Operations in the South and Southwest Pacific for 1943 were now explicitly limited to Phase 2, while the capture of Rabaul was judged infeasible within the year. Instead, Pacific commanders were instructed to plan and conduct offensive operations strictly within the limits of the forces already allocated, scaling their ambitions to match the hard realities of manpower, shipping, and air strength shortages. Furthermore, the Joint Chiefs of Staff reaffirmed the 1942 decision that once commenced, Halsey's South Pacific operations in the Solomons would proceed under MacArthur's general directives, a formulation accepted without any precise definition of what that authority actually meant. These understandings were formalized in a new Joint Chiefs of Staff order issued on March 28, 1943. Under its terms, the Southwest Pacific area was directed to seize positions along the northeastern coast of New Guinea and the islands of Woodlark and Kirrawina, while the South Pacific Force was ordered to secure the Solomon Islands as far north as southern Bougainville. From these forward positions, Allied air power could be brought within range of Rabaul. Japanese supply lines could be increasingly disrupted, and pressure steadily applied against Japan's main bastion in the South Pacific. While MacArthur continued to think in terms of broad strategy and distant objectives, Halsey kept his attention fixed on the immediate tactical realities of the South Pacific. He knew that once the fighting around Guadalcanal subsided, many of the warships supporting his Third Fleet would be reassigned elsewhere across the Pacific, sharply limiting the forces he could rely on. Guadalcanal had also driven home a hard lesson. Control of land-based airfields dictated everything. Halsey's planning, therefore, centered on seizing existing Japanese airstrips or capturing islands where new fields could be built quickly. From that perspective, the Japanese airfield at Munda Point on New Georgia emerged as the next logical step up the Solomons, a necessary stepping stone on the path toward Bougainville and beyond. In concept, his approach closely aligned with MacArthur's emphasis on air power and forward bases, even if it was shaped by far tighter practical constraints. These converging lines of thinking came together on April 26, 1943, when Admiral Halsey and General MacArthur met in Brisbane. There they agreed on a third major revision of MacArthur's earlier Elkton concept, merging their respective plans into a single, unified framework that became known as Operation Cartwheel. This final plan was deliberately conceived as a complex but flexible campaign rather than a single decisive blow. It called for a series of roughly 13 amphibious landings and advances carried out over an 8-month period, with the South and Southwest Pacific areas operating in close coordination and providing mutual support. Rather than massing forces against heavily defended positions, the plan emphasized a step-by-step advance, capturing key airfields and strategic islands that could be secured with limited ground commitments. From these forward bases, Allied aircraft would steadily expand air cover, isolate Japanese garrisons, and support subsequent moves. The operation was scheduled to begin in June 1943, with simultaneous advances on 2 axes. In the Southwest Pacific, MacArthur's forces would move to seize Woodlark and Kirrawina Islands, extending Allied air power along the New Guinea flank. At the same time, Halsey's South Pacific force would strike into the Central Solomons with New Georgia. From there, successive operations by both commands would unfold in sequence, each reinforcing the other, steadily tightening the pressure around Rabaul. Yet the first of those moves in the Solomons came only weeks after the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal, when on February 21, 1943, elements of the U.S. 43rd Infantry Division and the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion carried out an unopposed landing on the Russell Islands, 60 miles northwest of Guadalcanal, in an operation designated Clean Sweep. Launched as a shore-to-shore move directly from Guadalcanal, roughly 9,000 troops secured the undefended islands, providing forward anchorages and supply base sites that would support the next phase of the advance. At the same time, planning for the invasion of New Georgia, designated Operation Toenails, was already underway. Work on the operation had begun as early as January 1943, even before the fighting on Guadalcanal had fully ended and would later be folded into the broader framework of Operation Cartwheel. From the outset of the planning process, geography dictated almost every decision. The New Georgia Group was a dense maze of jungle-covered islands, shallow lagoons, and coral reefs, poorly mapped and largely unexplored inland. Its terrain was mountainous, swampy, and unhealthy, while barrier islands and reefs rendered much of the coastline inaccessible to large ships, sharply limiting where and how Allied forces could land. Furthermore, the key objective, the Japanese airfield at Munda Point, was shielded not only by Japanese defenses and reefs, but also by dense mangrove swamps and shallow lagoons that made it inaccessible to ocean-going vessels. The Kula Gulf on the western side offered deep water access, but it lay under the threat of Japanese naval forces and coastal guns, while narrow passages and shallow channels ruled out any direct seaborne assault on Munda. The only practical alternative lay across Blanche Channel on Rendova Island. Unlike New Georgia, Rendova could be approached from the open Solomon Sea and offered sheltered anchorages suitable for large ships. From there, Allied planners could land troops and heavy artillery within striking distance of Munda, bypassing the reefs and lagoons that protected it. In short, the geography of the New Georgia Group left planners with little choice. Any attack on Munda would have to be indirect, shaped as much by coral and jungle as by Japanese defenses. By May 1943, an agreement had been reached on the basic outline of Operation Toenails. The plan called for near-simultaneous landings on Rendova, which would serve as the main staging base and artillery platform, along with seizures of Viru Harbour, Segi Point, and Wickham Anchorage on nearby Vangunu. From Rendova, American artillery could place the Munda airfield under direct fire, neutralizing its defenses and supporting the subsequent landings on New Georgia. With these preparatory moves complete, the main attacks would begin, first against Munda and then against Vila on Kolombangara. However, by the spring of 1943, the forces available for the New Georgia operation were already sharply constrained. Of the three Marine divisions in the Pacific, the 1st and 2nd were still recovering from the exhaustion of Guadalcanal, while the 3rd remained in training. This left only 2 battalions from the 1st Marine Raider Regiment ready for immediate employment. As a result, the burden of Operation Toenails would fall largely on the U.S. Army. The main strength of the landing force came from Major General John H. Hester's 43rd Infantry Division and Major General Robert S. Beitler's 37th Infantry Division, both assigned to 14th Corps under Major General Oscar W. Griswold. Together, these formations would provide the manpower for a series of landings across multiple objectives scattered throughout the New Georgia Group. Given the scope of the plan, Admiral Halsey directed his amphibious force commander, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, to divide the landing force into 2 task groups. Under this arrangement, Turner personally commanded the larger Western force built around the 43rd Division's 172nd and 169th Infantry Regiments and 1 battalion of the 103rd Regiment, responsible for the main landing on Rendova and for supporting the subsequent landings on New Georgia, including the advance toward the Munda airfield. A smaller eastern force, under Rear Admiral George H. Fort, consisted of the remainder of the 103rd Regiment and elements of the 4th Marine Raider Battalion, tasked with seizing Viru Harbour, Segi Plantation, and Wickham Anchorage. The 37th Infantry Division was held in reserve on Guadalcanal, ready to move forward on 5 days' notice. Even with this streamlined organization, Toenails remained a demanding undertaking, requiring multiple near-simultaneous landings followed by additional assaults in rapid succession, all conducted in some of the most difficult terrain yet faced by Allied forces in the Pacific. And once again, big thanks to Supremacy, Call of War 1942, for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Don't forget to click the link in the video description or pinned comment and claim your exclusive starter pack, including the new loot boxes that can drop the brand new Marines unit of $25 value. Don't miss out. This limited time offer ends in 30 days.